Let's understand the world a little better. I'm your host, Timo Wunderlich, and with me is Chrisanthi Giotis. She's a journalist and lecturer in journalism at the University of South Australia and author of Borderlands, Decolonizing the Words of War. Hi, Chrisanthi.
Hi, Timon. Thank you for having me.
Let me first ask you, to your definition, what do you think is good journalism?
Mm. Okay, so good journalism can be a lot of things. You can have good journalism at a very local level. So if you are in a local community and you are getting journalism, maybe it's even just about your a school fate, but it makes you feel connected to that community. That's good journalism, right? Journalism that makes you feel part of a public sphere, to me, that's good journalism. But good journalism is also journalism that has context, that makes you actually understand the story from different perspectives. Good journalism is journalism that shows you that we are all connected in this society together. So that's maybe a big statement, but I think that really that's what good journalism is about. That's why journalism exists. We're here, we have special privileges as journalists, including in law, because we are here to be a medium between power and between the people, but also between people themselves. So I think good journalism is journalism which connects you.
And showing every part of the story or every part.
Yeah.
Okay. And what problems do you see currently with that or with journalism in general?
So the problems that I see currently with connecting in journalism is twofold. So first you have journalists who aren't actually thinking about that, but are thinking about clicks, are thinking about how their story can grab the most attention. You think you're not really thinking about the diversity of perspectives because actually it can be more effective and easier to put one perspective forward. And also, we live in a world where algorithms reward that sort of journalism, opinionated journalism. So it's getting very hard. I see it even with my students. It's getting very hard to for them to distinguish between journalism and opinion, right?
Mm.
Um, but I also see that as journalists, we're missing so many stories, and we're missing stories because of time constraints and resources constraints. But we're also missing stories because we're not really understanding the world that we're living in. So, especially from my perspective, looking at the refugee crisis, like every 2 seconds a person is displaced. But how many
Wow.
people actually understand that? That is a huge news story that is not being properly told.
Every 2 seconds.
Every two
Wow.
seconds, yeah.
That's unbelievable. I mean, if one hears that for the first time, that actually is unbelievable.
Yeah.
But about your point with trying to keep up with algorithms, for example, so that it fits the so that it generates more views. Isn't that something that's important as well? I mean, if you write, let's say, a good story with all perspectives in mind, but it isn't being read in the end, then that doesn't help anyone, right?
Yeah, totally. No, absolutely. And that's the other side of it. So, this is why actually digital platforms have to take some responsibility for good journalism because they have to design algorithms that do reward good journalism and not just algorithms that reward partisanship and opinionated journalism. Because that's what's happening at the moment. There is more reward given to journalism because it's more likely to be interacted in, it gets surfaced higher. Um, we're seeing that problem. And there's been some attempts to change that, but there's still so much more that digital platforms have to do to encourage quality journalism and to surface quality journalism.
What did these attempts look like?
So there's been some interesting experiments. So there was a YouTube experiment where they actually took um, the sensationalist feeds off people's feeds, so and replaced it with more measured and quality feeds. And at first, people's watching fell, like they watched less, but after a time, actually, the viewership went back up, and people also felt better. So this was actually a well-being experiment. It wasn't actually about quality journalism, but it just happened to to interact with quality journalism, which is how I know about it. But yeah, it was actually a well-being experiment, and they did find that people did feel better, which goes back to my point about connection.
Interesting. Do you know how they measured the quality of one channel?
Yeah, so this is another this is another really difficult area. Like, how do you measure quality? But in that particular experiment, from what I've read, like I wasn't involved in the raw data. I've just read reports on it. Um, it was basically taking away the more sensationalist content, so the more partisan content.
Because in I live in Germany, and here we have the öffentlich-rechtlichen, so that's media, state-owned media in the end, or not state-owned. That's wrong way of describing it, but it's everybody has to pay it, but it's separate from the state. But everybody has to pay for it, like taxes, in a way, so that investigative journalism and also not just sensational journalism has a voice, and a big one that is. And but even there, even for the öffentlich-rechtlichen, they had and have to adapt, and are um, are doing more and more entertaining work as well, because um, people not many people don't watch it if it is not in the end also entertaining. So there's this walk, which is difficult, as to how much it should be entertaining in the end, but you still want to get the people informed. So that's hard, but that's interesting that YouTube did or tried to do there something, and that it actually in a way worked, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see more of those experiments. Although, just on the entertainment point, because one of my best friends is a comedy news journalist, and comedy news can be amazing investigative news. It can be amazing, good quality news. So I do believe that you can do journalism, good quality journalism that is also entertaining, and not just in comedy news, but that's a really obvious
Okay.
type.
Okay, yeah, okay. But I get, because I guess that's important, because that's something I wanted to say um when you said that the algorithms are based in a way that the sensational content is more rewarded. I mean, isn't it in a way that the algorithms just support what the viewer wants, or what the viewer clicks on? I mean, I see it for YouTube, for example, which is a platform I'm using, but also TikTok and other social media platforms. It's mainly about the watch time, so how long a video gets watched as a percentage or in total. Um, so how, how much, or what content keeps the person on the platform, and what they click on in the end. What they decide to watch. So it's in a way what just it gets rewarded what the people want.
Yeah, look, that's part of it from a individual producer's point of view, but from the point of view of recommendations and shareability, um, the the infrastructure works in a way where people are more likely to interact with content that is more emotionalized and more partisan, right? So that's just human nature. So the algorithm then rewards that interaction. And so the question is, like, instead of rewarding that interaction, could you give more reward, for example, um, to long form journalism or podcasts or whatever that have more quality interaction with it, right? So, you've seen things like, are you sure you want to share this story? You haven't read it. Okay. Um, I don't know if you've seen that warning come up on, on Twitter or Facebook. Like, that's sort of been brought in to try and stop that sort of um, instantaneous emotional reaction. And we know for a fact that a piece of fake news will get seen 3 times more than the correction, right? 3 times more people will see fake news than the correction. That's something to do with the algorithm. That's something to do with the way that the platforms reward emotion. And fear is
Mm.
a huge emotion. It's a huge button pusher. And that's always been the case. And journalism has always used fear, right? And there's always been sensationalist journalism. It's just that the platforms have such a huge power dynamic and such a huge influence on what we see that it adds to adds to this issue in a way, to a degree that we haven't had to deal with it before.
Um, Coming back more to your book, I'd say you've been in total, I think, in 11 countries. You said in Africa, and you talk about decolonizing journalism. Now, what does that mean?
Yeah, so for me, decolonizing journalism has a few different parts to it. Uh, Firstly, it's actually acknowledging our history, our colonial history. So, for foreign correspondence, for example, we are actually the products of colonialism, pure and simple. The first famous foreign correspondent was hired by the Belgian king to justify his colonial project in the Congo. And I write about this in the book. It was kind of a Kim Kardashian show of the time, in that he was the he was the star. All the people who traveled with him had to sign non-disclosure agreements that they wouldn't write about their experiences until much later. So he got to define the situation, and he got to define Congolese as in need of colonization. He would often compare them to animals, and dogs he would label superior. And he did this quite consciously and purposefully. At the time, it was the time when cars were coming into being, and rubber was really important. And there were a lot of rubber trees in the Congo, and it actually eventually led to the term red rubber, because the number of people who died for this rubber. Congolese would get their hands chopped off if they wanted to work in their farms instead of working um, for the rubber plantation. So, this is the history that we come from. And of course, that's not what journalists do today, but the words that we've inherited actually still influence us. The frames that we use still influence us, and those frames come from that colonial time. So part of that is, when we talked earlier about what is good journalism, it's about not being ahistorical. You have to understand that this history still has effects. When you go as a white journalist, when I am reporting in Africa, I have to understand that I'm not going to be completely trusted. There is a long history of spying. I've been told a couple of times, well, I'm not going to tell you everything because you might be a spy. And there is also a long history of exploitation. And so you have to earn that trust, and you can't go in there, thinking, oh, we are part of the fourth estate. We're here for the public, and people are going to accept that, because in the past that hasn't been the case at all. So that's a huge part of it, is understanding the history, and understanding how we are seen by others. So it's not just about how we see others, but how we are seen by others. Um, and the other part of it is not thinking that we know best, right? And that's a huge trap that that you fall into as a white person in Africa, to be honest, because that's what so many white people in Africa are doing. And this has been written about really well in development studies. There's a really famous book by William Easterly called The White Man's Burden. And again, this completely comes from colonial thinking. So we have decolonized many things, but we haven't in other ways. Um, and I also think that decolonized reporting is paying much more attention to money flows and to international governance and to understand how neo-colonial structures still exist.
So if I were to go to the Congo, for example, as a foreign correspondent, as my first job as a journalist, how could I best how could I best work or best prepare myself to do good journalism and to not fall into this or to not make this problem worse?
Yeah. So first of all, going as your first assignment to the Congo is a bad idea
Okay.
because because it is a really, really complex place. um, and you probably should not do that. um,
Okay, okay. No
but
take, no take. That's the first one.
um, but one of the things that I developed, I was really lucky to develop, to be able to study this as a researcher after I had been a journalist, and seen how difficult it was to actually do good journalism and to do different journalism. Um, and so in the end, what I developed was this thing called the frame reflection interviews, where you go and you speak. So in my case, I was speaking to refugees from the Congo living in Australia before I went over there. And I didn't go to them as interviewees, I went to them. I use the philosophical term interlocutors, but basically it means like I'm coming to you with an open mind. I want to learn from you. I want to understand the world from your perspective. I want to have a conversation with you. Um, and what you do is you show them pieces of journalism. You show them and you ask what's good, what's bad, what's ugly about this, right? And that then allows you to see the world through their eyes, and you see that you're looking at things, you're looking at the same images but understanding them in completely different ways. um, and I think that you really need to have that perspective. So I'll give you an example. So in one of the interviews that I did, uh, before I went over the most recent time, I was I was showing, a clip from a refugee camp in sub-Saharan Africa, but at the news at the time, there was a lot of image of refugee camps in Syria. And my interviewees pointed out, well, look at the quality of the housing in the refugee camp in Syria and look at the quality in this clip. Doesn't refugee mean the same thing everywhere in the world? Is like this is a world injustice. And I'm seeing exactly the same things, but because it's natural to see, you know, stick huts and like tarpaulin, like from the old IMF food bags for refugee camps in sub-Saharan Africa, it never occurred to me. Like, well, why is the quality so poor? Because, you know, it just looks. This is what we always see. So to ask questions from the point of view of the most marginalized people, of the people who have, actually suffered the effects of colonization. That's also decolonized reporting.
So in a way, would maybe the better foreign correspondents be local reporters?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Um, so at the very beginning, we talked about I talked about what I think good journalism is, which is connection. I think that there are two types of foreign correspondence, or foreign correspondence, as in two types of reporting. And there's the reporting that connects you, and there's the reporting that creates others. And I think that the
Mm.
reporting that connects you is so important. We can't get rid of that, especially in this global world, because we do have still global power dynamics. And my iPhone here is impacting the war in the Congo because there is such a thing as conflict minerals that end up in electronics all over the world, right? If you go to the main square of Goma, which is the city in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has been the site of a conflict for over 20 years, you know, more responsible for more deaths than World War II. In the middle of the city, there is this statue of a guy with his wooden. It's called a chikudu. It's like a kind of a wooden bike that they use to transport raw materials. But instead of raw materials, like instead of the minerals instead that they usually transport, it's got a picture of the globe. It's got a sorry, the statue has a globe, and that's so true. Like the raw materials coming out of the Congo are going all over the world. We are connected, but we just don't see that in our journalism. We don't write enough about that. Um, so for that reason, I think that foreign correspondence should be reformed, not thrown out. Also because when I was over there and I was talking to local journalists, in particular when I was talking to the local journalists who help the foreigners, they were like, we need you to report things that we can't. Because sometimes it's much more dangerous to report things as a local. Sometimes it's the opposite. It shifts and changes. Like sometimes it's more dangerous to be a foreigner, but often it is really important to have that foreigner there as well, and for the local journalists to be feeding them information. But again, decolonized reporting means actually listening to the local journalist and teaching and treating them as a partner, which
Mm.
unfortunately doesn't happen as much as it should.
Um, why do local journalists have to fear, or maybe that's the wrong word, but why do they have to watch out?
Oh, the local politics, it's, um, I mean, also they have to stay on the, they have to keep their connections with local warlords, to be able to keep reporting and to keep finding out, so that they can't go as hard on certain stories. But this is the same all over the world. So in Australia, we have really horrible refugee policies, um, and a lot of that involves our relationship with Indonesia because refu- uh, refugees end up in Indonesia and then they're trying to get to Australia. Um, and there's a policy of boat turnbacks, so, similar to the situation that you have in Europe. I mean, unfortunately, that policy came from Australia. We really have so much to be ashamed about. But a lot of the things that the Australian government is doing in Indonesia, our journalists found very difficult to find and to report, but Indonesian journalists were able to do that. So, this is, and worldwide now, we do live in this interconnected world, and there's amazing organizations like the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists who work together on these big stories to break, like the Panama Papers, which was all about tax havens around the world, or they've also broken stories about the really poor quality uh, uh, surgical mesh and health products that are being sold around the world. So actually, journalists working together all around the world is I think a really positive development. But again, it has to be a partnership, and that means decolonizing our thinking.
Um, and if they get mentioned, or I'm assuming they do, the local journalists, isn't that a problem as well for them?
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, so it really should be the local journalist's choice whether they're going to get their name on the story or not. Um, in some cases, for example, like on a documentary, they would want their name because it would help them get more work, right? So yeah, it depends. It really depends on the situation, and on the story, and it should be their choice. But they should also be paid more, which is also about decolonizing, because
Um,
money talks, right? Like if you pay good money for something, then you're actually going to value that more.
of course, of course, and then more people will pursue that, and better journalism probably gets made in the end, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
One thing that I would say is an argument for that foreign correspondence should also, meaning the journalism should also not just be made by locals, but also by foreigners. Is one thing that I think you said in your book is not a good thing. That is that journalists have already the story in mind. Now
Mm.
that I don't necessarily see as something good, but they have the audience in mind, right? So they, in a way, they therefore prepare the story differently or write the story differently. But shouldn't the audience also be in mind? I mean, if they in the end are supposed to read it and not just glimpse over it and oh, that doesn't interest me, isn't that still important?
Yeah, look, that's actually a really good point. And to go back to your question of what makes good journalism from the beginning, I would say that good journalism is something that takes the audience from where they are to a new place. So you're right, like having the audience in mind and knowing where they are and what might interest them and hook them in the first place is really important. Um, but equally as important is taking them somewhere new. So if you leave the audience where they are, then I think you've done a disservice, essentially. Um, and yeah, like if I can talk a little bit more about that point about going over with a set idea. Um, Again, this relates to the structure of the reporting and the fact that it's not a partnership. So, in all journalism, you go out with some idea in your head about what the story will be, but you usually have, some flexibility. You're usually open to new ideas. You're usually listening. You're usually trying to um, capture new angles, or at least you're listening. Anyway, is the point. You're listening and you're valuing the knowledge that you're hearing, and you're understanding the new knowledge that you're getting. That doesn't always happen. There's a lot of examples, not just from my own work, but a lot of foreign correspondents. They sort of do a mea culpa. They say, this is where I stuffed up, where I wasn't paying attention, where I got stuck on the story that I'd gone there to do. And I think that part of that is because of that history of going in there like a white expert, and that's the structure that you operate in as well. Like there's so you're funneled into this community of white experts when you're over there. You become part of this expat community, and it becomes very hard to listen properly to the local perspectives and to have that flexibility.
So, meaning when you travel to, let's say, the Congo again, you're not necessarily with the locals, living with the locals there, as one would maybe assume, but with whom? With
With
other journalists?
with international workers, with the UN, there's a huge UN presence. With NGOs, yeah, like it's with international expats.
And so that a lot of time gets spent with them and not with the locals, and so you get a different perspective, a different view on the situation, and
Yeah,
influenced in a
exactly.
way.
Absolutely, exactly. And also, from yourself, like, when you're traveling, sometimes you actually get quite set in your ways and set in your thinking, and you get stuck on things because you're out of your comfort zone. And so actually it's really easy to kind of, sometimes it's really easy to not be a good person when you're traveling. um, and to try and go for the comfort thing, and breaking out of that is actually really important.
That's actually interesting. Probably one could uh, what can see oneself as a foreign correspondent when they go in on their own vacation, to see, do I really know what this country is like? Do I really find out what this city is like, or do I just follow the set path as a tourist?
Yeah,
I,
absolutely.
I like that. That's interesting. So everyone can practice that in a way. um, what I wanted to ask you more about is frame theory or frames in general. Now, what I think everybody has a somewhat understanding of what a frame is, but could you define it, or explain it again, and what sort of frames are there?
Yeah, so I guess there's a few different ways to think about frames. So at a very basic level, and this is when we're thinking about it in terms of writing, right? You think about frames, you put a frame around a picture and something is cropped out, right? Something is left out. So when you frame something, it's an act of selection. It's an act of selection of what is in the story and what's left out of the story. All right, what is going to be the focus of this story? Um, but it's a little bit more than that, because framing also involves repetition. So it's selection and repetition. So you're building up idea of what the problem is and what interpretation is based on what you select and what you repeatedly select for inclusion in the story. So that's a very basic sort of idea of framing at the writing level, and it can actually have really strong effects. So, for example, there's a very famous study by Shanto Iyengar, and he found that with issues of poverty, if the story is framed around a single person, what he called an episodic frame, but it's basically framed around a single person, a single episode in a person's life. Um, then poverty is seen as an issue for individuals, an individual's fault. Whereas if a story about poverty is framed contextually, where there's actually multiple perspectives entered, then it is seen as the government's issue. Like, government should be doing something about it, society should be doing something about it. So these frames actually have really strong effects on audiences without them even knowing it. Um, and, it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because we can't see, like the Gestalt picture, we can't see the young lady and the old lady at the same time, right? You see one or the other. And so the frame directs your attention. And that's why framing is so powerful. Framing also exists at the level of individuals. So Irving Goffman, I think back in the 30s, um, talked about this in terms of as a sort of sociological way of talking about it, where when human beings are constantly asking what is going on here, and to answer that question, we draw on our existing frameworks of knowledge. And so already whenever we encounter a new situation, we are framing the situation based on what we know. And that's the other way that framing works. So this is why decolonization is so important. So if you have gone to the Congo and the only book that you've read about the Congo is Heart of Darkness, then you are going to have a very colonial mind frame. You know, that's supposed to be an anti-colonial book, but it has no African speaking characters in it. And this is a huge problem that we see in journalism from Africa, is that actually white people are given voice on local issues, instead of Africans speaking for themselves. That still happens way too often. And so, but if you've read Chinua Achebe or Chimamanda Adichie, you're going to have a more nuanced picture. I mean, they're Nigerian authors, but still, you're going to have a more nuanced picture of sub-Saharan Africa and of the dynamism of Africa. So framing also works on that level. It works on the way that we as human beings frame new situations, frame situations of uncertainty, what we draw on.
So one can probably not demand from the audience beforehand that he has read several books on the topic. So a journalist would need to include these views in their article, for example, right? Um,
Exactly, exactly. And
about the yeah.
oh, sorry, and I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not just research about your topic, like it's all the things that you've ever read which will frame the questions that you ask and the way that you see the situation.
Makes sense. But then there would so that's not probably necessarily a bad thing, right? That's just a thing that is, and everybody's different. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, but you have to be aware of what you have read and what you've been exposed to and what,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know, and to be self-conscious like that and to think about, okay, well, what areas who am I hanging out with in my reporting assignment? You know, what knowledge have I come here with? What authors have I read before coming here? Um, you know, like this is to be self-aware, because if you're claiming to make knowledge about a place, then you have a responsibility.
And then what do I do? I should I put a disclaimer first, or should I what would be the best way to should I inform the viewer, or should I maybe read up on the other stuff? That's probably it, right? Or should I do?
I think that it depends. Like, if you don't have time to read up on the other stuff, like, put a disclaimer.
Okay.
Because sometimes that will happen, you know. But being honest about that and saying, "Look, I've just arrived in this place and I'm not 100% sure what's going on, and I haven't done a lot of research, but this is what I'm seeing right now, and it could be wrong." Um, that's actually really important. Like, and that's something that we don't see. There's a famous example from the most recent invasion of Iraq, where journalists were really confined to hotel rooftops and reporting from their hotels, but that there wasn't any disclaimer about that. You know, they
But probably is there why aren't there these disclaimers, or why aren't there these things? Is there just maybe not enough time in a way? The attention span gets too short, and if that's what I see first, I'm already logging off, already watching different content, or what is the reason?
I think it's hubris. I
Hmm.
think it's ego, to be honest. Um, I think that it's just not something that we're used to. We haven't adjusted to our new reality. You know, like especially in war zones, you know, journalists are much more restricted in their access in some ways than in the past, in conflict zones. And the we haven't adjusted our news practices, our news, you know, our news frames to this new reality. We haven't been keeping up with what's going on.
You said there are two types of frames: one the individual, and the others probably aren't. I mean, you said that's you mentioned the story of poverty, for example, where you show one individual who is in a poor situation, um, and uh, and a group of people. Um, I didn't know that. if I were a journalist, and I mean, maybe you get these things over time and you learn this, but I didn't know that. I would have maybe reported on just one person, not knowing what I'm doing. And I'm assuming there are thousands of these frame problems out there. Also, probably many of them aren't even researched upon. Many of them probably aren't even known. How can I counter that then?
Yeah. I guess one of the ways that you could counter that is just to try and make sure that you're being diverse in your reportage and not doing the same sort of framing all the time. Um, but you're right. Like, how can you know all of this? I mean, that's why, I literally came into academia having had a problem in my reportage, in that I was in a refugee camp and I was trying not to create victims, and I was trying to tell a different sort of story, and I was finding it so hard. And that became a PhD problem as opposed to a reporting problem, right? And so, yeah, like, you're not, journalists aren't going to get it right every time. That's just not possible. Um, and I guess that's why at the end of my book, I talk about this and I say, we are going to fail again and again. And really, we need a philosophy of of journalism, especially for foreign correspondents, to put us on a sure footing. And I talk about the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, who really talked about respect for the other and talked about this idea of the interlocutor. And I think that, yeah, if you go into each interview situation trying to understand things from the other's perspective, and certainly not just about what you as the journalist can do, or what your questions and your story ideas. um, I think that that's a sure footing to start from.
Um, before I go over to one last topic and then another quick segment, some rapid fire questions, um, I would I would like to ask you: is there anything that I didn't ask that I should have, or anything you want to add?
No, no, I'm okay. Like,
Well, that's
nothing comes to mind right now, actually. But that is a really good final. That is a really good question to always ask as well at the end of every interview. I teach my journalism students that.
yes. Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, I ask that every time, and I had some really interesting, or many guests had some really interesting things to say in the end. So it was always worth it to ask it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I think we've covered such a lot that I'm sort of like feeling that, yeah, there's nothing that's standing out as not. Maybe actually, like, why I talk about Borderlands as a concept, like,
please elaborate.
instead of just conflict zones, because um, I really believe that we're missing a huge story here. That where we see these really long, unending wars on borderlands, like Gaza, for example, being an example, where actually there has been low level war for years, and then it's what my Congolese research participants would call blasting war. So they make a distinction between war and blasting war, because that's their reality too, right? Um, and we're not paying enough attention to these zones. Like, so much is happening there, so much war economy is happening there, but we're also not paying attention to the way that there are borders within these borders, and
Hmm.
you know which areas are we having access to and which areas are we not. um, that's something that I really use the term borderland, because there is a new social geography, like there is a new reality being created. Weber's nation state never properly took into account the fact that it was built on imperialism and colonialism. Like that was actually a huge part of the nation state as well, was the relationship of nation states to their colonies, but that was never really factored in. And we're seeing the outcome of that in these borderlands. And um, we need to start thinking about the world in a different way. And I don't
Hmm.
know that this is, yeah, I don't know that it's definitely the right term, but we have to start thinking about the world in a different, more connected way, more dynamic way.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's important too. That's interesting with the borders inside the borders as well. How do you um get a feeling for these, I'd say, or how are these?
So for me, a really interesting example was when I was in the Congo. There was this new boulangerie that had opened up. It was very exciting. All the expats were there. Um, but my translator, who I hadn't got through the expat society, but who I'd been introduced to through a local Congolese Australian before I left, he felt he couldn't go inside. So, firstly, he didn't know where it was, like, whereas I, as an expat, found it straight away. Or like, and secondly, yeah, he waited outside with the security guard, feeling that he couldn't go inside. So this is his town, and there's a cafe that he feels he can't go inside, which I had no problem going into.
Um, he, wasn't he also able to get inside, or I mean, if he would have wanted to go inside, or was it more so of a, yeah, the feeling?
It was more the feeling, I think. Like I, I don't like. I actually don't know why he was waiting outside with the security guard. I mean, obviously, like when I arrived, we all went inside together.
Mm,
Um, and it wasn't like there were not other Congolese there. There were rich Congolese, but there were other Congolese there. But it was just this, yeah, this feeling of this is not my space. So the fact that there's a space in his own town that he feels is not his space, and that
mm,
happens in
interesting.
every global city.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, of course, it's the same, or not. Maybe not the same. Maybe I'm over exaggerating, but I'm thinking of luxury stores who want to keep out the poorer parts or the poorer people of the country. Um, one thing I wanted to touch upon, because it seems to me like the total opposite of the kind of journalism philosophy you like, is one thing that really makes me sad in the last few months, years, that I learn more about journalism are certain corporations that build on are getting bigger, even on social media, that are reporting um, not to inform but to form an opinion. So in even in Germany, in on social media, I've seen now several channels which I was able to link back to one organization, one tree that finances these, and they are and you really can see that the people that report there, they know that what they're saying are not good arguments. And you uh, one thing was so obvious, for example, that when the attacks on in Israel happened, October 7th, I think it was, um, our the chancellor, Olaf Scholz, he a few days later, he was in Hamburg, where I live as well, with other prime ministers, I think Macron, for example, and they were in the harbor area, and were talking about what happened. And he actually ate there a what's it called in English? A bread with fish in it. That's something that you can get in the harbor. It's typical food there. And he was eating that, and somebody took a photo of him, a picture, and then there was this big tweet storm, which was originated by by this company, or by these companies, where our chancellor eats like really enjoys this fish bread, while Germans and others are dying there in the Gaza region. And the people who are reporting this, they know this is not a good argument. They know they just inflicting emotions and everything, and that's something. I really don't get angry at a lot of things, like almost at nothing, but that really makes me angry.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I just agree with you 100%. I mean, what is the point of that? What is, like, you're actually taking up airspace, you're taking up people's attention space, right? We live in an attention economy, and you're taking up people's attention with this trivial point, that is much easier to engage with than to understand the history of the Palestine-Israel conflict and how we got to this point, right? Um, it's encouraging the worst type of public discourse, and it's
Yes.
taking away time from the public discourse that we should be having. Um, yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. But this also goes back to my argument about algorithms. Like, the during the Trump campaign, when he became president, it was actually found that there was a couple of teenagers, and forgive me, I'm pretty sure it's Serbia, but I'm not 100% sure, like in a small village in Serbia, who were making a huge amount of money out of anti-Hillary Clinton, pro-Trump posts, and they had no political convictions whatsoever. It was just because that was what made them more money, because they
Mm,
were more likely to get reactions. And so this is the other thing, like, with those, with that organization which is sponsoring this Twitter narrative and this Twitter storm, are they doing it for political reasons, or are they just doing it to make money?
mm.
Neither is a good excuse, but um, yeah, you just don't know. Actually, and in Australia, because we have a relatively small population, our Twitter discourse is really easy to manipulate. So, it's very easy for a campaign to get something trending, which is something that journalists also need to be aware of.
Do you have any idea how one could? Because I mean, they're not reporting fake news. The chancellor was eating a fish bread, but do you have any idea how to? Because they were getting reactions, and a lot of people, or I don't know, a lot of people, but many people were actually agreeing with them, and were like, "Oh, yeah, this is outrageous. How can the chancellor eat a fish bread while people are dying? Like, as he shouldn't eat anymore or something." But so this in a way works. Um, but I mean, there has to be something that can be done against this, right? Because this this is not good.
Yeah, so Timon, this is where so with my students, I always say to them, like, I can give you knowledge about what's out there and research and what's happened in the past, but you're closer to the future than I am. So,
Mm,
we're here to to create solutions together. So, I honestly don't know. This I'm not a digital native. Um, I don't. I know that those sorts of stories have always worked. So there's something in human nature, and I think it is something about, well, it's easier to engage with the fish bread than it's to engage with the war, right? So
mm,
there's definitely something in that. Um, However, again, the scale of the outrage and the scale of the storm, like in the past, it would be like one photo, and it would, but you would also, but it wouldn't take up the entire news cycle. Um, and I don't know how. I mean, what would you? Do you have any ideas? Like, I'd love to hear
oh,
them.
sadly, I don't. That's why I'm asking you. Ah, okay.
We'll
There got to
keep the.
be a solution.
I think,
We will find something.
we will find something. In conversation, we'll get there. I mean, maybe it's about calling it out. but then again, like the yeah, you know, on social media, having those conversations and trying to call things out just usually leads to more anger and more misunderstanding.
The only thing I found when I thought about this was more education in a way. So getting people to know and realize and to see what good arguments actually are and what
Mm,
are not. Um, so for me, for example, that helped me a lot reading a book that what was the name? I think 30 the book of illustrated good arguments or bad arguments, I think it was. So it was just a book on logic in a way, so certain fallacies and biases that humans have that make sense in a way. They're heuristics, they're shortcuts, and one can see how we get to these, but they're still not good arguments, and you can fall into traps where you see the wrong thing is right. So that's the only thing I would see is yeah, more education on more better education. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. There's a great article called "You're Not Entitled to Your Opinion," which is all about, even opinions should be fact based, right?
Mm, mm,
And there should be a logical argument to an opinion. And I guess we've really lost that as a society. I think because we've lost the art of conversation in some respects, and also because our media is so fragmented. And so, in some respects, like you can't have conversations about the same topic because you've not necessarily read the same argument, so you can't take apart the topic on on the logic of the argument. Like you go to have a conversation with your friends, and you're like, "Did you see this?" And they're like, "No." "Did you see this?" And so then you just have like,
mm. That is really interesting, actually, because one would think, hey, our media is more fragmented. That means more different perspectives get seen, but they're not. You just see your own, right?
yeah, yeah, it's true. Not always. Not always. Sometimes it can really work to show different perspectives. And it certainly has the possibility. But yeah, quite often you end up down the rabbit hole and following your own perspectives.
Now over to the rapid fire questions. Are you
Okay.
ready for this?
Okay.
This is meaning I would be grateful if you could answer in around about 2 to 3 sentences. So I'll ask a question and then a more or less quick answer would that would be perfect. Are you ready?
I'm trying. Yep, I'm going. I'm going to do it. I'm doing
Some of
it.
these are personal, just so you know. Some of these are personal, so not necessarily linked to your area of research or focus.
Okay.
But you'll see as we progress. If you had a big poster, let's say on Times Square, everybody would see it. What would you write on it?
The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting,
That was quick.
which is a
Okay.
quote from Milan Kundera. And I I had that on my wall at home, and everyone loved it, so that's why.
No, that goes. That kind of takes away my next question, which is, do you have a favorite quote? But maybe that's not your favorite one. I don't know. Otherwise, I would skip that. Or is there any other
uh,
quote you would like to mention?
um, look, I have a favorite quote from Aristotle about anger, which I think is really interesting. Which is, I related to what we were talking about with social media. Like, anyone can be angry; that is easy. But to be angry with the right person at the right time in the right measure, that is not easy, and that is not within everyone's ability.
That's good. A controversial opinion, I believe, what almost nobody else does.
Ah, I believe what almost nobody else does. In fairies? Um, no, um, no, that's not actually true. Um, uh, Oh gosh. Oh, pass. Can I come back?
Yeah, it's no, it's okay. You can pause. You can just skip, and then we go over to the next one. What would you have liked to known earlier? Let's say when you were 20.
um, I'd like to have known how to talk about my work earlier. Um, yeah, I think I'd like to have known how to have talked about my work earlier. I think I'd also like to have known how to use contacts earlier, to be honest. That
Okay,
wasn't.
now I said 2 to 3 sentences, but maybe can you elaborate more on that?
So you know, basically, I didn't know that the world worked on who you know. And I would have liked to have known that earlier so that I could take better advantage of the world, I guess.
What's your newest, biggest insight?
Newest biggest insight. Um, I'm actually loving the power of podcasts recently. Like that's something that has been a, a lot in the forefront of my mind. Um, but also with the recent election that we had here, the referendum election in Australia, um, I did a lot of door knocking, and I was um, it was a huge insight to see how much just a little bit of history changed people's minds and gave them a different perspective on the issue.
Um, what do you see as the biggest problem in journalism today?
Um, Biggest problem. Uh, yeah, opinion. The lack of distinction between opinion and reportage.
How would you spend $1 billion to try to solve that problem, if that is possible?
Say it again. How would I spend $1 million? What?
Billion dollars to try to solve that problem, if that is possible.
Oh, $1 billion to try and solve that problem. I would build my own digital platform.
That rewards different kind of okay.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay. How would you spend $10 billion to make the world a better place? So not necessarily about your area of focus, but in general.
Uh, um, I would campaign for no borders. um, yeah, I think that we would actually be really stunned at what a different place the world would be.
That's super. Now I would like to talk about that. God damn it. Because that I find super interesting. I never really understood. I mean, I know why we need them in a way, but still, I would like to campaign for that as well. In another, so maybe I'm just not educated. I'm definitely not just not educated enough on the topic, but um, yeah, that would be interesting. I think.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Do you want to say more
Oh no,
about that?
I was just gonna say, like, I mean, I think interesting is the absolute right word. I just think that the results will be so surprising, when people see how natural people movements are after a while, and how, as a society, we're much more cooperative than we are antagonistic when those antagonisms are taken away.
Mm,
You know.
mm, mm. Especially because what I always thought, maybe it's different in Germany than in many other countries, probably, but um, this is a multicultural country, I would say, especially Hamburg, for example, Hamburg and Berlin. And I don't know, that's might be something special for Germans as well, but I don't really see myself really as a German. Like that's not really something like, oh, I'm a German, that that doesn't mean really a lot to me. I would say, and I really never really understood people who so hardly um, identify with their country in which they were born, and I feel like,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
I don't know.
interesting. So I grew up in a super multicultural neighborhood, and I always said, like, I'm Australian because Australia values multiculturalism. Like,
Mm.
if I didn't feel that value for multiculturalism, I would think I would have struggled to have identified myself as Australian.
There, actually, I would like to talk longer with you because I really enjoyed this conversation. I gotta say, this was really interesting, really fun. Thank you very much. Yeah, maybe we do another one at some point. At some point.
That
Thank
would
you
be
for being here.
wonderful. Thank you,
Thank you,
Timon. Thank you
Chrisanthi.
very much.